This story was sent to me by Sarah M. via email. I was staring at the deadbolt on the bedroom door, my hands shaking as I realized it could only be locked from the outside. The key wasn't anywhere to be found, and I could hear footsteps moving around in the hallway just beyond that thin piece of wood. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I was 24 and had just gotten my first real job after college in Portland. The company was putting me up in temporary housing for my first month, and they'd booked me this cute little Airbnb in what looked like a residential neighborhood. The photos showed a cozy basement apartment with its own entrance, perfect privacy, and the reviews were mostly positive. The host, David, seemed friendly enough in our messages, mentioning he lived upstairs with his family. When I arrived on that rainy Thursday evening, David met me at the side entrance that led directly to the basement unit. He was probably in his 50s, average height, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. Nothing particularly memorable about him, which I guess should have been my first red flag. He showed me around the space, which was exactly as advertised. Small but clean, with a bedroom, tiny kitchenette, and bathroom. The only weird thing was that he spent a lot of time explaining the locks. "This one here locks from both sides," he said, demonstrating the bedroom door lock. "Sometimes guests like extra security, you know? And this main door, well, sometimes it sticks, so don't panic if it seems hard to open from the inside." He handed me 2 keys, one for the main entrance and one for the bedroom. At the time, I thought it was thoughtful that he cared about my security. The first few nights were completely normal. I'd come home from work, make dinner in the little kitchen, and sleep soundly. David and his family were quiet upstairs, and I barely knew they existed. It felt like having my own private apartment. But on Sunday night, things started feeling off. I woke up around 3 in the morning to what sounded like someone walking around upstairs, which wasn't unusual. But then I heard what sounded like someone on the stairs leading to my entrance. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I lay there listening, telling myself it was probably David checking something outside, maybe taking out trash. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited for the sound of him walking away, but it never came. After about 10 minutes of complete silence, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. There was no one there. I convinced myself I'd imagined it and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next night, Monday, I came home to find my bedroom door was closed. I distinctly remembered leaving it open that morning because I'd been rushing and grabbed my jacket from the chair inside. It's funny how you notice these little details when something feels wrong. I opened the door and everything looked normal, but there was this feeling like someone had been there. You know that feeling when the energy in a room is just slightly different? I decided to test something. Before leaving for work Tuesday morning, I placed a small piece of tape on my bedroom door frame in a spot where it would break if the door was opened. When I came home that evening, the tape was broken. Someone had definitely been in my room. That night, I decided to stay awake and see what happened. I turned off all the lights and sat in the living room chair that had a view of both the main entrance and the bedroom door. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard those same heavy footsteps on the stairs outside. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the main door lock. My blood went cold. The door opened slowly, and I could see David's silhouette in the doorway. He stood there for what felt like forever, just listening. I held my breath, trying to stay perfectly still in the darkness. He took a few steps into the apartment, and I heard him moving around in the kitchen area, opening cabinets quietly. Then he walked toward the bedroom. I heard him try the bedroom door handle, but I'd locked it from the inside before starting my little surveillance. He stood there for a minute, then I heard him walk back toward the main entrance, but instead of leaving, he did something that made my skin crawl. He pulled out his phone, and I saw the screen light up his face as he started typing something. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed with a text message from David. It said, "Hey, just wanted to check if everything's okay down there. Thought I heard some noises and wanted to make sure you felt safe." I watched him standing there in my living room, waiting for my response. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched as he waited about 5 more minutes before finally leaving and locking the door behind him. I sat there until sunrise, my mind racing. He had a key to my space and was coming in while I slept. The next morning, I packed everything I could fit in my work bag and left for the office as normal. But instead of going back that evening, I called my company's HR department and explained I needed emergency alternative housing. I didn't go back to get the rest of my stuff for 3 days, and when I did, I brought 2 coworkers with me. When we arrived, David seemed genuinely surprised to see me with other people. He asked if everything had been okay with my stay, acting like the perfect concerned host. I told him I'd found other housing and just needed to grab my remaining belongings. As we were loading my stuff into my car, my coworker Jake asked David about the bedroom door lock, saying it seemed unusual. David's face changed completely. The friendly host mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. He said something about previous guests requesting extra security, but his voice was different, harder. Jake later told me he got a really bad vibe from the whole interaction. I never left a review for that Airbnb. Part of me wondered if I should warn other potential guests, but I also didn't have concrete proof of anything beyond him entering my space, which he could claim was for maintenance purposes. But I did report it to Airbnb customer service, though I'm not sure anything ever came of it. To this day, I only book Airbnb places where I have the entire property to myself, and I always change the locks or use door security devices. That experience taught me that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural. They're the people who have keys to your temporary home and think they can get away with violating your safety because you're just passing through their life. I found this on a Reddit thread by user mountainhiker23. The scratching sounds in the walls weren't coming from mice. They were too rhythmic, too deliberate, and they only happened when I was trying to sleep. It took me 3 days to realize someone was living in the space behind my bedroom wall. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this nightmare. I'm a freelance photographer, and I travel a lot for work. Last fall, I had a 3-week assignment in a small mountain town in Colorado, shooting for a tourism campaign. The town was tiny, maybe 1,500 people, and accommodation options were limited. I found this Airbnb listed as a rustic cabin experience about 10 miles outside of town. The photos showed a cozy log cabin surrounded by pine trees, and the price was reasonable for a long-term stay. The host, Carol, seemed friendly in our message exchanges. She mentioned she lived in town and that the cabin was on her family's old property. She said she'd leave the key under a fake rock by the front door, and that I probably wouldn't see much of her during my stay, unless I needed anything. Perfect for me. I prefer privacy when I'm working. The drive up to the cabin was beautiful but isolating. The dirt road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching the property. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, small but well-maintained, with a living room, kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom. It had that authentic mountain cabin feel, complete with log walls and a stone fireplace. The first week went smoothly. I'd wake up early, hike around the area taking photos, come back to edit and upload my work, then spend the evenings reading by the fire. The solitude was exactly what I needed after months of city living. The only odd thing was that the cabin felt bigger from the outside than it did from the inside, but I figured it was just the way log construction worked. On the 8th night, I first heard the scratching. I was lying in bed around midnight when it started, a soft but persistent scratching sound coming from the wall behind my headboard. At first, I assumed it was mice or squirrels in the walls. Old cabins always have critters, right? But after listening for a while, I noticed the scratching would stop whenever I moved or made noise, then resume after I'd been still for a few minutes. I got up and walked around the cabin, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The scratching stopped immediately when I got out of bed. I waited in the living room for about 20 minutes, then crept back to the bedroom. Within 5 minutes of lying down, it started again. This pattern continued for the next 2 nights, scratching that only happened when I was in bed trying to sleep. On the 4th night, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. During the day, I walked around the entire exterior of the cabin, measuring and comparing it to the interior layout. That's when I realized there was definitely unaccounted space. The cabin was about 30 feet long on the outside, but the interior rooms only added up to maybe 24 feet. There was a 6-foot section that didn't correspond to any room I had access to. Looking at the cabin's construction, I could see there was space between my bedroom wall and the exterior wall, enough space for someone to move around in. The scratching wasn't coming from small animals. It was coming from something much larger moving around in that hidden space. That night, I pretended to go to sleep as usual, but I stayed up with my camera ready. Around 11:30, the scratching started, but this time I was ready for it. I quietly got up and pressed my ear to different spots on the wall, trying to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. What I heard made my blood freeze. It wasn't just scratching. I could hear what sounded like someone shifting position, the soft rustle of clothing or fabric. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like breathing very close to the wall. Someone was definitely in there, and they knew exactly when I was in bed because they could probably hear me too. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the living room with every light on, trying to figure out what to do. I was miles from town, no cell service, and no landline in the cabin. My nearest neighbor was probably miles away. If someone was living in the walls, they clearly had been doing it for a while and knew the property better than I did. The next morning, I drove into town and went straight to the local police station. I explained the situation to the sheriff, a guy named Martinez who looked like he'd seen everything small-town law enforcement had to offer. He listened to my story with a serious expression, taking notes. "You said the host was Carol?" he asked. "Carol Brennan?" When I confirmed, his expression darkened. "We've had reports about that property before. Nothing we could ever prove, but we've gotten calls from guests over the years. Strange sounds, feeling like they were being watched, items going missing." Sheriff Martinez agreed to drive out to the cabin with me that afternoon. When we arrived, he immediately started examining the exterior structure. He found what I'd missed, a small access panel hidden behind some landscaping on the backside of the cabin. It was partially concealed by overgrown bushes, but you could see it had been used recently. "This leads into the space behind the walls," Martinez explained. "Someone's been getting in and out through here." We pried open the panel with a crowbar from his truck. The space inside was larger than I'd imagined, about 6 feet wide and running the full length of the cabin. There were signs someone had been living there: blankets, empty food containers, a battery-powered lantern, and, disturbingly, photos that had clearly been taken through small holes in the walls. Some of the photos were of me sleeping, eating, working at the kitchen table. Someone had been watching my every move for over a week. Martinez called for backup, and they processed the scene like a crime scene, which I guess it was. They found several small holes drilled through the wall at eye level, positioned to give clear views into the bedroom and living areas. The person living in there had been conducting detailed surveillance of every guest who stayed in that cabin. It turned out Carol knew about the hidden space. The property had been in her family for decades, and the space was originally built as a root cellar, accessible from inside the cabin. At some point, the interior access had been sealed off and the exterior access added. Carol claimed she had no idea anyone was using it, but Martinez wasn't buying it. They never caught whoever was living in there, but they found enough evidence to arrest Carol as an accessory. Apparently, she'd been renting the cabin to solo travelers for years, and there had been multiple complaints about strange incidents that she'd dismissed as guests being paranoid about staying alone in the woods. I packed up and left that day, staying in a hotel in town for the rest of my assignment. The whole experience made me completely rethink how I choose places to stay. Now, I always do a thorough walkthrough of any property I'm renting, checking for spaces that don't make sense or could be accessed from outside. The scariest part wasn't the person living in the walls. It was realizing how long they'd been watching me without me knowing. Every private moment for over a week had been observed and photographed. It makes you question every place you've ever felt sleeping alone. Someone DM'd me this on Twitter. The family photos on the refrigerator showed 3 people, but the Airbnb listing said it was just a couple renting out their guest room. I should have asked about the third person in all those pictures, especially the young woman who appeared to be trying to communicate something with her eyes in every single photo. But let me back up and tell you how I got involved in what I now realize was a hostage situation. I was traveling through Nevada for my brother's wedding in Reno and decided to save money by staying in Airbnbs instead of hotels. This particular listing was in a small town about 2 hours from Reno, perfect for breaking up the drive. The hosts, Jim and Linda, had great reviews, and their messages were friendly and helpful. The guest room was described as private with its own bathroom, and they mentioned they were an older couple who kept to themselves. When I arrived at the house around 6 p.m. on a Friday, Jim greeted me at the front door. He was probably in his 60s, wearing a cardigan and khakis, very grandfatherly. He showed me to the guest room, which was at the back of the house, and explained that Linda was at her book club but would be back later. The room was clean and comfortable, exactly as advertised. "We're pretty quiet folks," Jim said as he showed me around. "We usually turn in early, so don't worry about disturbing us if you need to come and go. There's coffee and cereal available in the morning, and Linda loves to cook breakfast for guests if you're interested." Everything seemed perfectly normal, even quaint. After Jim left me to settle in, I walked through the main areas of the house to get familiar with the layout, which he'd encouraged me to do. That's when I noticed the photos. They were everywhere, on the mantle, covering the refrigerator, lining the hallway walls. Most showed Jin and Linda at various ages and locations, but in a significant number of them, there was a third person, a young woman, maybe early 20s, with long brown hair. What struck me as odd was her expression in every single photo. While Jim and Linda smiled naturally at the camera, she always looked tense, almost fearful. In some pictures, her smile seemed forced. In others, she wasn't smiling at all, just staring at the camera with what I can only describe as pleading eyes. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I was looking at a group of photos on the kitchen counter when Linda came home. She was a small woman, probably late 50s, with graying hair and a floral dress, very typical grandmother type. "Oh, you're admiring our family photos," she said, walking up beside me. "That's our daughter, Marie. She's away at college." Something about the way she said "away at college" felt rehearsed, like she'd said it many times before. "She looks like she's about my age," I said, trying to make conversation. Linda's demeanor changed slightly. She became fidgety, adjusting the photos unnecessarily. "Oh, she's very focused on her studies, doesn't get home much anymore. Very busy, you know how college kids are." Then she quickly changed the subject, asking about my travel plans. That first night passed without incident, but I kept thinking about those photos. The young woman's expression haunted me. There was something desperate about her eyes that I couldn't shake. When I woke up Saturday morning, I could hear Jim and Linda talking in the kitchen, so I decided to ask casually about their daughter. "Marie must miss home," I said as Linda poured me coffee. Jim and Linda exchanged a quick look that I wasn't supposed to catch. "Oh, about 2 years now," Linda said. "She's very independent." But here's what bothered me. Some of those photos looked recent. There were pictures that included smartphones and modern clothing, not 2-year-old college photos. And in the background of some pictures, I'd noticed what looked like the same furniture that was currently in their living room. I decided to do a little investigating. While Jim and Linda were out grocery shopping that afternoon, I took a closer look around the house. I wasn't snooping through private areas, just paying more attention to the common spaces I had permission to use. In the hallway bathroom, I found something that made my heart skip. There were 3 toothbrushes in the holder, not 2. One was clearly used regularly. It wasn't dusty or old like something that had been there for 2 years. In the shower, there were 3 different types of shampoo, including one that was clearly for younger people. Most telling was what I found in the kitchen trash. Underneath some newspaper and food scraps, there was a piece of paper that looked like it had been ripped from a notebook. In handwriting that looked young and feminine, someone had written "Help me" multiple times, like they'd been practicing or trying to get someone's attention. That evening, Jim and Linda went to bed early as promised, around 9 p.m. I stayed in my room reading, but around 11, I started hearing sounds from somewhere in the house. It sounded like muffled conversation, but I couldn't make out words. Then I heard what sounded like someone crying. I crept to my bedroom door and listened carefully. The sounds were coming from somewhere above me, probably an upstairs bedroom. But Jim and Linda had shown me their bedroom, which was on the main floor. I hadn't seen any stairs leading to a second floor during my tour. The next morning, I paid closer attention to the house's exterior structure. From outside, I could clearly see there was a second story, but from inside, I hadn't seen any access to it. During breakfast, I casually mentioned the house's architecture. "It's such a charming 2-story house," I said. "I love older homes like this." Again, that quick exchange of looks between Jim and Linda. "Oh, we just use the main floor now," Jim said. "The upstairs is just storage, and the stairs are getting too hard for us to manage at our age." But I hadn't seen any stairs at all, accessible or otherwise.
After breakfast, while they were busy in their room getting ready for church, I did a more thorough search of the main floor. Behind a door I'd assumed was a closet, I found a narrow staircase leading upward. The door had a padlock on it, but it was old and not very secure. I knew I was crossing a line, but something in those photos and that handwritten cry for help made me feel like someone might be in real danger. I managed to work the padlock open. It was more for show than actual security. The stairs creaked terribly, but I could hear Jim and Linda's voices from their bedroom, so I continued up. The second floor had 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. One bedroom was clearly being used as storage, but the other was set up as a lived-in space. There was a bed with rumpled sheets, personal belongings, and most chilling, a heavy deadbolt lock on the outside of the door. Someone was being kept in that room. I heard footsteps downstairs and realized Jim and Linda were moving around, probably getting ready to leave for church. I quickly went back downstairs and relocked the door, but I was shaking from what I'd discovered. As soon as they left for church, I called the police from my cell phone. I explained what I'd found and my concerns about the photos and evidence of a third person living in the house. The dispatcher took it seriously and said they'd send officers to investigate. I waited for the police in my car, parked down the street. When Jim and Linda returned from church and saw the police cars, their demeanor completely changed. Gone was the friendly grandparent act. They were arrested that day. It turned out Marie was their daughter, but she wasn't away at college. She was 23 and had been held in that upstairs room for over a year after she'd tried to leave home and move in with a boyfriend they didn't approve of. They'd been keeping her locked up, telling neighbors and anyone who asked that she was away at school. Marie had been trying to communicate her situation through those photos for months, hoping someone would notice her expression and realize something was wrong. She'd also been leaving notes in places where she hoped guests might find them, like the trash can where I'd found her cry for help. The police found evidence that Jim and Linda had been systematically isolating Marie from the outside world, taking her phone, her ID, controlling every aspect of her life. They'd been using Airbnb income to support themselves while keeping her trapped upstairs. Marie is safe now, but the whole experience changed how I look at the places I stay. Those family photos that seem so normal and welcoming might be telling a different story if you know how to look for the signs. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the perfect host facade.
This was shared with me on Instagram by Alex R. The keypad lock on the front door changed its code every single day, and I didn't realize until the third night that I was being systematically trapped inside. Each day, my host would text me a new code, claiming it was for security reasons. But what I didn't understand was that the old codes were being deactivated behind my back. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up in what became a carefully orchestrated prison. I'm a graduate student and I travel for research conferences pretty regularly. Last spring, I had a conference in Austin and decided to stay for a few extra days to explore the city. Hotels were expensive during South by Southwest, so I found this Airbnb about 15 minutes from downtown, a small converted garage apartment behind a main house. The listing was posted by someone named Marcus, and all our communication was through the app's messaging system. He seemed professional and accommodating, explaining that he traveled for work frequently and had converted the space to help cover his mortgage. The photos showed a modern, clean space with a small kitchen and a comfortable living area that converted to a bedroom. When I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, Marcus met me in person for the first time. He was probably in his early 30s, well-dressed, and very friendly, now that I think about it. He spent a lot of time explaining how everything worked, especially the smart lock system on the front door. I use a keypad lock for security and convenience, he explained, showing me how to punch in the code. I change the codes regularly for safety reasons, so I'll text you whenever there's an update. Don't worry, it's just my security protocol. He demonstrated the system several times, making sure I understood how it worked. The apartment was exactly as advertised, modern and clean. Marcus mentioned he lived in the main house, but traveled frequently for work. "You probably won't see much of me," he said. "I'm flying out tomorrow for a business trip, so you'll have total privacy. Just let me know if you need anything." The first 2 days were perfect. I attended my conference sessions, explored Austin, and enjoyed having a quiet place to return to each evening. True to his word, Marcus was nowhere to be seen, though I occasionally noticed lights on in the main house, so I figured he hadn't left town yet. On Friday morning, I got a text from Marcus saying he was updating the door code for security and sent me a new 6-digit combination. I thought nothing of it and punched in the new code when I returned from the conference that evening. It worked perfectly. Saturday morning, another text with another new code. Again, I didn't question it. The conference was over, and I planned to spend the day exploring Austin's music scene before flying home Sunday. When I returned Saturday night around midnight, the new code worked fine. Sunday morning, I got another text with yet another code change. This one seemed a bit excessive, 3 code changes in 4 days, but I figured Marcus was just very security conscious. I was planning to check out around noon anyway, so it would only matter for a few hours. But that's when things started going wrong. I was packing my stuff around 11 a.m. when I realized I'd left my phone charger in my rental car. I tried to leave the apartment to get it, but when I punched in Sunday's code, the lock didn't work. I tried it several times, thinking maybe I'd mistyped, but nothing happened. I went back inside and checked Marcus's text to make sure I had the right code. I tried it again, being extra careful with each digit. Still nothing. The lock wouldn't budge. I was effectively locked inside the apartment. I texted Marcus explaining the problem, but he didn't respond immediately. After an hour of waiting, I started to panic a little. My flight was at 4 p.m., and I needed to return my rental car and get to the airport. I tried calling Marcus, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I decided to test something that made my blood run cold. I tried Friday's code, the one from 2 days ago. It didn't work. Then I tried Saturday's code from the day before. Also nothing. Only then did I realize what was happening. Marcus wasn't just changing the codes for security. He was deactivating the old ones, which meant he had complete control over when I could leave the apartment. I was trapped, and it was deliberate. I started really panicking then. I tried everything I could think of, looking for another exit, trying to force the lock, even considering breaking a window. But the apartment was in a converted garage with only one door and windows that were too small and too high to escape through. Marcus had chosen this space specifically because it could be easily controlled. Around 2 p.m., 3 hours after I'd first tried to leave, I got a text from Marcus. "Sorry about the delay. Had some issues with the smart lock system. Try this new code." But something about his tone felt different, less professional, more amused. The new code worked, and I practically ran to my car. But as I was loading my luggage, I noticed Marcus watching me from a window in the main house. He waved casually, like nothing strange had happened. I drove straight to the airport without looking back. It wasn't until I was safely on my plane that I started thinking clearly about what had happened. The daily code changes, the systematic deactivation of old codes, the convenient malfunction right when I needed to leave for my flight. None of it was accidental.
Marcus had been testing how much control he could exert over my movements without me realizing it. If I hadn't needed to get something from my car that morning, I might never have discovered I was trapped. I did some research when I got home and discovered that smart locks like the one Marcus used keep detailed logs of when codes are used and when they're changed. If I'd been more tech-savvy, I might have realized sooner that the old codes weren't just changed, they were deliberately disabled. The scariest part was how gradual and normal he made it seem. Daily code changes for security, it sounded reasonable, but it was really a systematic test of whether he could control my ability to leave without me catching on. If I hadn't needed to get something from my car that morning, I might never have discovered what he had planned for guests who didn't.